So what I wanted to do today was just talk about kind of what a difference a year makes in terms of where we are with cloud computing, how the market in the government space is evolving and developing, and where we're seeing some kind of trends and patterns emerge around what agencies are doing and how they're incorporating the new requirements that OMB has put out for them, as well as how they're incorporating some rather innovative approaches to implementation. I thought I would start by giving a bit of a perspective on the mindset of agencies. We can go to the next slide. Just a snapshot of an opinion poll we did around some of the federal executive community and the IT space to give you just a kind of a sense for where their mindset is relative to cloud computing. So we asked the question, do you have cloud computing solutions in place? About 20% of the organizations that we asked had already had established cloud computing solutions. So still clearly a long way to go before we're seeing kind of broad adoption of cloud across government. But we then asked the question, what do you anticipate the impact of cloud computing to have on your organization from an IT perspective? And obviously you see a much stronger, kind of more compelling guidance there, 54% believing it's going to have a major impact on their organization. And major to many people means different things, but in our view, a major impact means kind of underpinning changes to the way the budget and the way that their IT activities are provisioned. So rather extensive belief across the market that this is clearly an opportunity, which is why I imagine many of us are in the room today. And then we talk about kind of the key motivators and the key inhibitors around cloud computing. Probably not too many surprises here. The first being cost savings is kind of the primary driver for adoption. Cost savings in many agencies is becoming much more near and dear to their hearts given the budget environment that we find ourselves in and the kind of combative environment we have among our two political parties around how much cutting we need to do across government agencies, particularly in the discretionary area, which goes to ultimately pay for the salaries of government employees, provide contract services and IT products and services that many of you provide if you're on the vendor side into government. And I think this is one of the opportunities that I see for the government in an environment where there is such a need to rein in costs, is that critical kind of crisis environment also brings about an opportunity for change that otherwise wouldn't be there if things were going along just fine and there were no kind of compelling reason to change. As you all probably know, following government, it's got a fair amount of inertia to it, and so when there's no compelling need for change, things tend to not change. They continue down the path that they're on, and we have kind of an opposite environment going on with a compelling need for change, and that, I think, could be a real opportunity to drive adoption of cloud computing as agencies are forced to kind of think in creative ways about how they handle their environments. But then obviously still the biggest barrier, clearly probably not a surprise to many of you, is the security component. And for those of you who maybe are in a sales role, you probably are familiar with the FUD factor, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's probably as big an issue as the security requirements themselves. That uncertainty around once my information or data or systems are in the cloud, am I taking options away from myself and my organization if a regulator or a legislator comes around and changes the playing field and puts me in a position where I no longer have the ability to comply with whatever regulation or legislation that might have been implemented that would hinder my ability to do what I'm required to do by law or by regulation. So that's kind of just level setting the mindset of the agency. Let's go to the next slide. Obviously, cloud computing, like any technology, has kind of an adoption curve. And if we were to kind of characterize in broad terms, obviously different agencies are at different stages, and I would say even different organizations within an agency are at different stages of adoption. But if I were to categorize kind of broadly where we are in the government space, it's really kind of building the foundation. And what I mean by building the foundation is providing that environment where agencies can confidently move forward in terms of acquisition policies and procedures, security requirements. There's not a lot of upfront kind of work for them to make a decision to go cloud versus non-cloud. They can do it as kind of a natural part of their environment. So we're seeing a lot of effort in OMB, GSA, the NIST, and the CIO Council to try to put that foundation and framework in place so that organizations can move forward confidently and not have to create a lot of additional work that doesn't get leveraged across agencies. So there's a couple initiatives that I'd like to talk about. The first two, FedRAMP and SAJAC, not Pat Sajak from the Wheel of Fortune, a different SAJAC, that really is two initiatives that are designed to provide the policy, the security foundation, and the leverage so that agencies can draw from the work of other agencies and only create new what is needed for their unique environment. So leveraging, we'll say FSMA, for example, some of the policies and processes that are associated with FSMA for a particular application or particular provider, leverage that work across the agencies so that they don't have to start it from scratch. So that's kind of what this environment is about, as well as setting up standards that are interim standards while we're waiting for the rest of the market, kind of in more commercial terms, to define clear standards that can be adopted by agencies confidently. So we don't want to wait until those formal standards are defined, which could be years from now. We want to make sure we're progressing now on things that we can test, and can control, and can manage, and put those standards in place on an interim basis, and NIST is really driving that. Then I want to talk about the other key areas, the budget environment. Typically, when agencies are kind of plowing along and there's no compelling need to change, it's OMB that has to assert its authority from a budget point of view and use that budget stick to drive agencies to do things that they want it to do. A few years ago, it was the Y2K conversion. More recently, we've seen it with IPv6 and agencies kind of getting forced by OMB to comply with that. And then now we have cloud computing. To be fair, OMB isn't always successful with these initiatives. OMB doesn't ultimately control the budgets. They have a lot of control over budgets, but certainly the appropriators have a lot of control over the budgets as well, and they don't always have alignment on the technology initiatives that OMB is trying to drive. But in the case of cloud computing, having that budgetary requirement as part of the IT investment planning process is at least forcing agencies, or going to be forcing agencies, to consider their alternatives relative to cloud, and that's where the cloud-first policy has really come into play. And I think there's a couple of things that are important to consider relative to the time frame of implementation of this cloud-first policy, at least as it plays out in the IT investment plan. So for those of you who are followers of the federal IT budgeting environment, there's this process called the Exhibit 300, which defines major business cases that are to be made around major investments in IT. So what the guidance that's come out of OMB has basically said is, for 2012, what we're going to do is have cloud be forced as a consideration for an alternative for major new systems, major new initiatives, but they don't necessarily have to force it upon themselves for existing initiatives. The next year, they're going to be forcing it for the new as well as major enhancements, and then the following year is when they have to force it on their steady state initiatives. So whatever you have going that's kind of in a steady state environment, you got to look at that and figure out what you're going to do with cloud computing, if anything, relative to that, and tell us what you're going to do and do a formal assessment related to that. So there's still a little bit of runway for agencies as it relates to how they go about considering cloud computing in some of their major initiatives. In this budget environment, how many major new initiatives are going to be kicked out in the 2012 timeframe? Between you and me, it's probably not going to be a whole heck of a lot, but it's still, again, foundation laying to kind of get the playing field put in play. Next slide. So now let's just talk about some examples of where cloud computing is getting adopted, and I think there's some interesting splits here. The first is, I'll talk about some of those organizations that are pursuing and implementing cloud from a public cloud point of view. You all probably are aware of the difference between a public cloud, which is kind of the mainstream providers in the commercial world, like Salesforce, Google, Amazon, those types of folks. And then you have, on the opposite spectrum, agencies setting up private clouds where they're basically serving as a cloud provider to other agencies, and that's become a rather popular approach, particularly for some of those organizations that are already providing IT infrastructure services as a service in some way, shape, or form to other agencies. So I'm going to give a couple examples of each. We'll take the example of GSA, rather significant move by them, kind of being an example setter by declaring that they're going to be moving their enterprise email to the cloud and a cloud provider. And then you have the Army that has been using Salesforce for its recruitment activities and an application there. So those are kind of examples of public cloud use inside of agencies. And then you have those agencies and those organizations in government that are already providing IT infrastructure services to agency customers, DISA being one example in the military, major provider of IT infrastructure services, computing capacity, telecom network services to other DoD organizations, really putting in play effectively a private cloud-like environment to enhance and automate and facilitate speed, the development of software, testing, et cetera. There's a lot of requirements associated with putting up a new computing environment in the DoD. So what this is trying to do is accelerate that process, allowing an organization to quickly spin up a compliant environment that they can use for those types of things like testing and development. And then you have another couple examples on the civilian side. The Department of Interior and NASA both are providers of IT services, IT infrastructure services to other agencies, and they're effectively building cloud computing capabilities in as another way of delivering service to their customers. So I tend to describe this as an example of Blockbuster, which seems to be going the wrong direction for many of you who might have liked to go to the store for your videos. Really forced an enterprise-wide change across the industry to this mail approach, and now we're seeing it go to more of an on-demand type of video approach. And I tend to think of IT infrastructure services being similar kind of model where you're seeing the model for provisioning the service just evolving and changing. And those organizations that are providing those services are adapting their offerings to accommodate these new and different ways of providing those services. Next, the impact of cloud computing across industries. Software, hardware, IT services companies, communications and networks is going to be extensive. In the federal space, it's going to be no less extensive. We'll talk about software first. Quickly, obviously, this is forcing fundamental changes to how traditional software providers are licensing their services to match those of the cloud providers. Has some rather interesting effects on the financials of those organizations, and you're also seeing a lot of those organizations kind of in the traditional software space rushing to provide cloud alternatives, or at least cloud-like alternatives, so that they can match the capabilities that are being rolled out by some of the pure-play cloud providers. And you're also seeing opportunities for new companies, new software around metering, provisioning, that effectively allow an organization to stand up a cloud-like environment for a set of customers that might be inside or across a set of organizations. On the hardware side, data center consolidation is clearly driving significant changes around how there's demand for equipment and what areas are demanding equipment. Some customers are drying up and going away altogether as they move their infrastructure to a cloud or they move their applications to a cloud, while others are getting much bigger as they reinforce a large data center to enable it to handle a larger amount of capacity. And then IT services, now we're seeing a lot of opportunity for companies on the IT services side to help those agencies understand how to implement this technology, what it means for their organization. But as you look kind of down the road, you see the large infrastructure providers being very worried and concerned about the underlying revenue streams that they've had associated with providing infrastructure services and support to those agencies, where that gets undercut by a cloud-like offering. And then we also see a big opportunity in communications and network services. This area really hasn't materialized as quickly as some of the other areas, but you could think about an example of unified communications, your phone, voice, instant messaging, email, all of that effectively being provided in a unified way through a cloud environment. And that one's just kind of materializing in our observation. Next slide. So let's talk about the market. Specifically, we're talking about the federal market in this case. We generally define cloud computing in three major buckets: application as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service. We've seen applications kind of lead the way by being kind of the early adopted components across the federal government. That's the first area that we've seen getting adopted. But the growth, particularly as you think about data center consolidation and the initiatives that Vivek Kunder's put out, is really driving growth in the infrastructure space a bit faster. Still relatively small market in the scheme of things, about $400 million, which is less than 1% of what the federal government spends on IT today. But obviously this is growing. That's the real story, is this area is growing about 5 to 6 times faster than the overall budget. So, and we're actually starting to think as we look out that these numbers might be conservative relative to the growth estimates, depending on the rate and speed with which agencies adopt this technology. So just to wrap up, I think as you look at the challenges ahead for many of the organizations that are involved, let's start with the agencies. Clearly reaching economy of scale and getting to that point where other agencies can look at their peers and see them doing it. They're going to feel more comfortable doing it themselves. Many agencies are followers, not leaders, relative to the adoption of technology because of the nature of the risk of the work that they do, the public visibility of it. They're not inherently risk-taking organizations for the most part, and I don't think as citizens we necessarily want them to be either. So that's key for us to watch, is to what extent do other agencies adopt it and become those examples that other agencies will follow. And that has a lot to do with cultural barriers and overcoming those cultural barriers, taking down some of the regulatory and legal issues that might be in the way, as well as policy issues that need to be put in place. And I don't want to underscore the acquisition policies as well. That's clearly another key challenge. From the vendor point of view, certainly there's challenges for those companies that are pure public cloud players to really build that adoption and gain the confidence of the market that you're a viable solution in the federal space and that the federal government can overcome the kind of mindset that is different, inherently different, and therefore isn't like the commercial world. So you're not seeing quite the adoption that we've seen in the commercial world, but we think that's going to continue to accelerate. And then the risk for many companies that are kind of established players, particularly those large IT services companies, the top contractors that many of you see on the top 100 list, how are they going to be impacted? How are their revenue streams going to be impacted as these major infrastructures move to a cloud? How are they going to be impacted as many agencies might move to a private cloud? They might still be the provider of the service to those large data centers that are providing service across government, but you're going to see a lot of those smaller data center providers dry up, and I think that's going to actually hurt smaller companies more than it's going to hurt the larger companies. But there's clearly opportunities around this relative to helping agencies understand it, helping them implement it, as well as demand for new types of software, new types of products that help them enable it and implement it in a more accelerated fashion. And so with that, I'm going to just give you an opportunity to ask a couple questions if there are any before I turn it over to the next panel. I'm sorry, I am a fast talker. You are going to have the slides available to you if you desire. I know you're going to be making them available to the attendees. So I saw somebody taking pictures, and I wanted to kind of cut them some slack and tell them that I was too busy talking too fast. Dan.
So, Kevin, I was delighted to hear that you think your projections may be too conservative when you look out to 2015. So if you take off your conservative hat, what sort of, I think you had 27% compound aggregate growth rate. So if you take off your conservative hat, what kind of growth do you see?
Well, let me put it in these terms. So I think in the government market, because big dollars can move things in a big way, so if some notable organizations move some significant, say, email systems, infrastructure systems, something like that, where they're moving a big amount of money and a big amount of capacity to something that can swing the market very quickly to a much higher growth rate. So I think it's going to depend on 3 to 5 really big deals that are going to totally change kind of the landscape. So it's not going to be incremental across many agencies. It's going to be 3 or 4 really big deals that push it across from a growth point of view.
How significant is the trend for entrenched contractors, this whole idea of major vendors now adopting cloud or moving towards cloud? How significant do you think that trend will be to decelerating the government's ability to match the commercial ability for cloud? Because what's happened in the commercial space is a lot of small and innovative companies have gained traction quickly because of a less risk factor. But in the government, there's that risk factor, the FUD factor you call it. And so how significant do you think this trend of entrenched players, I won't mention names, but in terms of regulating the acceleration process?
So normally what I've seen is when emerging technologies and companies that own those emerging and are developing those emerging technologies grow up to get a critical mass, they get acquired, right? So the proprietors of those companies see a very attractive kind of multiplier on their business, and a large company that really wants to own that particular asset and capability so that they can leverage across their business will go and acquire them. And that wouldn't surprise me at all to see that in this space either. There's some, I think, niche players. Once you understand the government and you have a great technology and how the government works, you have a real advantage relative to a commercial provider that might have a great technology but has no idea how to do business with government.
Oh, I have a question, but is your red light telling you you got to get going?
We'll take one more.
Okay, sorry. I know we're going to have speakers who are going to talk about barriers and hurdles. You mentioned policy and regulations that potentially could be impeding the process of adoption. Are there any that they are not going to mention? I assume you've got purview of what their discussions will be about, that you would just want to mention might be some consistent barriers or at least delays and impediments towards adoption of cloud?
So they tend to fall into security policies that are not clearly defined, but uncertainty around how they're going to get defined and what limitations that might put on somebody who's going forward. So that's the uncertainty piece is, I don't know what it is. You're telling me it's going to be okay, but you can't guarantee that because you haven't defined them yet. And on the acquisition side, it's more, there are licensing models that are very different than how the government has traditionally done business. And they have to be established so that agencies are confident that these licensing models are okay for us to pursue. And I think those are the key challenges that I see for many agencies, aside from just the understanding and the lack of understanding about how cloud works. With that, leave you to the next panel, and thank you all very much.